take us through today's session. So welcome to everybody. My name's Hayden Bratt, for those who don't know me. So I am a founder and partner of Mindset Leadership, and today's session is leading through the crisis and beyond. So what I'm going to take you through today is really to focus on how do we lead through this current crisis, and whether the content that I'm going to take you through, whether it's about the current pandemic that we're dealing with at the moment, or whether it's any other crisis that you might find in your business. I truly believe that each and every one of us can come through situations of difficulty stronger and better prepared to thrive. Because every crisis has an end point, and even the current crisis, even though it seems like it's going on forever, will end at some point. And those that are able to lead through them will always find that they end a crisis better than they started it, even if sometimes it doesn't feel that way. So today's webinar is going to focus on a few different thoughts and ideas, as well as reflecting on the actions of certain of today's most prominent leaders to evaluate their actions and how effective these are or not in leading through the crisis. I'm also going to be sharing with some latest research that's come out about how to lead through this specific crisis, and also sharing some thoughts from people who really dealt with difficult situations in various different places around the world, and again what they've shared around their ability to lead through crises such as this. So it's all designed to help you to reflect on and consider your own approach and what perhaps you might be able to do differently. So I love this quote from JF Kennedy. And again, I'm not entirely sure how accurate his Chinese is. So if there are any Chinese speakers, then forgive me if this isn't accurate. But I love the quote anyway, because I do think it really kind of rings true. But when written in Chinese, the word crisis composed of two characters. One represents danger and the other represents opportunity. And the key thing around this is, in every time of upheaval or crisis or any situation where we face difficulties, yes, of course, there is the danger that we all see, whether that's the physical danger from something like the COVID-19 virus, or whether it's the emotional danger or the financial danger for our businesses. But there will always be opportunities. And already we're seeing stories of businesses that are pivoting in the current climate and thriving in those environments. So what today we really want to look at is, how can we find the opportunity amongst the crisis? And what do we need to do as leaders to manage our own emotional state to enable us to be really effective as we lead through the current situation and beyond? And that's the key part of today's session. This isn't just about how do we get through the next few weeks. This is how do we emerge through the next few weeks in a way that prepares us to be even stronger, so we can then go on and thrive beyond the current situation into this brave new world everybody keeps talking about, whatever that looks like. But how do we continue to push forward in a time when actually this current situation has come to a close? But let's have a look at crisis itself. So when we think about a crisis, we have very strong emotional reactions. And when we think about what happens in a crisis, this can have a big impact on the way that we respond and react to the situation and the circumstances. Typically, crisis creates a panic reaction. So when we hear the word crisis, or we face into a crisis, and certainly what we've seen over the last few weeks in the UK, there's been a significant amount of panic that's been happening. And the key thing around when we panic is we often don't think straight. So when we're in a panic mode, the blood in our brain is being pumped to our amygdala, which is our kind of emotional center, where our fight or flight reaction comes from. You know, it's a human evolutionary capability that we have that prepares us for action to get away from significant dangers. But often when we go into panic mode within a crisis, all of the blood flows to that part of our brain that supports that fight or flight reaction. And the key point about that is, when blood is flowing to that panic center, it's been taken away from the place where we probably need it most, which is where rational cognitive thought resides, which is in the prefrontal cortex. So when we are in this situation of crisis or panic, then we often find ourselves with making short-term reactions that are not necessarily conducive to our overall thriving or success or long-term opportunities. So we tend to be driven by our survival instincts rather than what we're looking for beyond that kind of survival. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about survival later on. So this lack of rational thought often creates confusion as we battle between our emotional panic reactions and the rational side of our brain. The internal conflict causes our brains to overwork, creating this feeling of being overwhelmed. And one of the most common words that I've heard over the last couple of weeks is this feeling of being overwhelmed by the emotions or overwhelmed by the situation, and people feeling that actually they are unable to cope with all of this kind of stimulus that's affecting us, and particularly with the current situation. We've got morning to evening news constantly updating us about the worst of the COVID-19 impacts, and constantly getting numbers of updates of the number of cases, the number of deaths, and it's a lot of pretty critical news, which is driving this ever greater feeling of kind of panic or concern. And again, whether that's from a personal well-being point of view or from a well-being of our business's perspective. So we become hypersensitive. And this is driven by the high levels of cortisol released into our systems as we become overloaded. So when we're in panic mode, when we're in that kind of fight or flight mode, we release the chemical cortisol, and cortisol is kind of a stress chemical designed to help our muscles be quick acting. But actually, when we're in a situation where we're not having to actively respond to a threat, then that cortisol flowing through our bodies can actually have a negative impact on the way we feel and our emotions, and can cause us to feel drained, can cause us to feel excessively exhausted by the constant barrage of information. Again, not particularly conducive for us to be thinking logically and sensibly about what we need to do in this crisis. You often find in a crisis that we stop trusting everything. So when you start to be driven by fear, and we can talk about fear in a second, we often find that we mistrust things that previously we would have just accepted. So even if we rationally know there's no reason not to trust it, we tend to go into this mode of second guessing everything, including ourselves. So often you'll find people who go through a crisis like this tend to really start doubting their own ability to lead through. Just at the time when we need our most confidence, we actually find ourselves being our least confident. And we often feel this sense of helplessness. Kind of the doom and gloom and the constant barrage of information gives us this sense that it's kind of, there's nothing we can do, and it's all going to end up in kind of some terrible state, this kind of sense of helplessness. There is no light at the end of the tunnel. And again, when we get into that mode of thinking as a leader, that can be really destructive for our ability to lead through the crisis. So what I'm going to share with you today is hopefully some thoughts that will help shift our attention to what we can do rather than what we can't do. What are the opportunities rather than what are the dangers? Because when we're driven by fear, which all of the reactions that I've just described are all fear-based reactions, we become fearful of what might happen and we anticipate the worst. And when we are gripped by fear, we cannot make effective long-term progressive choices. Our thinking tends to be short-term. We typically go into protectionist mode. We tend to focus on us as individuals rather than the greater good. And we often go with a safety-first survivalist attitude. And whilst that's totally understandable because we have got some significant threats, that fear-based reaction will only get us to a place of getting away from the fear, won't necessarily help us to get to a position where we can build and thrive on the back of the crisis that you're in. Often that initial short-term fear-based reaction leaves us exhausted and bereft of energy that we really need when we need to progress into the next stage of rebuilding or thriving when the opportunities come our way. And the key thing for us as leaders, and this is what this webinar is about, is leading through this crisis. Key thing for us about as leaders is how do we manage our own emotional state and our emotional reaction whilst helping to lead others away from danger, away from fear, into belief and into faith, that there can be a positive outcome, and we can, even if it will be tough, create a better future state. And at this time, and again, I'm going to share some insight a little bit later on in the webinar that we've received. At this time, we as leaders need to step up and help our teams overcome their own fears and their own concerns to provide a platform for us to then build from. And again, when we start looking at some of the reactions of some of the countries around the world, there's very different responses to how well different nations are responding to this kind of fear, panic situation that's happening in lots of different nations. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later on. So it's not really about surviving. We should be focusing on how we find a way to thrive beyond the current crisis. We might not necessarily thrive during the crisis, but how do we thrive beyond the crisis? We need to take our attention from what's happening now to our attention to the future state that we're going to want to try and create on the back of the current situation. So many of you will have seen this change curve previously. It's well known, there are various different formats of it, but the Kubler-Ross research, which sits at the heart of the change curve. And one of the things that we are aware of, and I guess the current situation is bringing to the fore, is we all go through this kind of emotional roller coaster that's related to this change curve. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to share some thoughts around the change curve that you can see on the screen in front of you, and then really think about what's our role as leaders to help others to come through this change curve with us in an effective way. Now, for those who know the background of the change curve, it was originally created out of studies into grief and grief responses. And when they studied grief, they identified these kind of 7 typical stages. There's a lot of talk at the moment that actually what we're going through and a lot of our emotional reaction at the moment is almost a grief reaction for the world that we once knew. So a lot of us are having to give up all of the things that we used to be able to take for granted. And many people are feeling very similar to how they would if they were going through a grieving process for lots of the normality that we used to have. And it's not uncommon that significant change in crisis can lead to a grief-like reaction. So if we look through and work through the change curve and have a think about kind of what happens in those moments, but also think about what we need to do as leaders. So the first step in the change curve typically is this kind of immobilization. It's the shock reaction when something happens. So something significant happens, and typically we tend to, in that moment, shut down and go into kind of a shock reaction. The immobilization, the kind of stop, let's just kind of take in what's happening, and can often be accompanied with that sense of kind of real surprise, that kind of freeze reaction that happens. And in that moment, we're not able to really think proactively around what we need to do. It is just how can I possibly move through this? It's kind of that real reaction that pulls us up. So in that immobilization, we typically see very little activity happening, and there is this kind of real kind of pause that happens either within a business or within an individual. The key thing for us as leaders in this stage is to have lots of empathy, for us to be understanding that our teams will have that shock reaction, will potentially shut down in the short term for a period of time until they come to terms with that initial kind of response. We probably saw this in the UK a couple of weeks ago, where there was this kind of initial thoughts around the virus, and a lot of people were kind of just stopped, and actually when it really started to hit, suddenly kind of caused this pause in everything that we were doing. So we need to have understanding for our teams that they will have some kind of initial shock reaction. Typically that's followed by this uplift in activity that's driven by a sense of denial. So phase 2 of the curve is this sense of denial. And for many, it's kind of either a refusal to accept the reality of it, or it is kind of frantic activity that in the mistaken belief that if I do lots of things, then it's not going to affect me. Now, I certainly had this response in my business when this whole crisis started. In the first few days, kind of real optimism of thinking it's only going to last a short period of time. If we do lots of activity in this short period of time, as we focus into it, if I go out and become really active, then I can ward off the worst impacts of the crisis that we're currently in. So typically you'll see this real drive for action, for I want to do things. Again, it's the It's the stress reaction or the fear reaction that's driving it, the feeling that actually I need to take action. I've got all of this cortisol running through my body because I'm seeing this fear coming in and I need some way to dissipate that. And it tends to be driven by this. I can avoid the situation if actually I just keep working harder, or I keep doing things, or I take action. Interesting enough, the panic buying reaction that we had in the UK is all driven by this denial phase. If I go out and buy all the toilet paper that I'm ever going to need, I can just sit tight and the whole thing will go away and won't affect me. It's driven out of the same emotional reaction. So as leaders, what we need at this point in time is we need to create a compelling vision of the future that provides some hope for our teams. We need to be able to support our teams. So whilst we understand it's going to be a tough situation, actually we need to be able to instill in our teams the hope and the vision that actually we can come through this and we can thrive. So whilst we as leaders are managing our own reaction, we need to be maintaining a view that actually this can be an opportunity that comes through it. So we need to try and tune into that kind of optimistic side of things, not in a way that lacks credibility. So not in a way that doesn't face into the reality of the situation, but in a way that really provides an opportunity for people to kind of hold on to something that can prevent that sense of overwhelm or hopelessness that we talked about previously. Then we start to move in. So after this initial phase of denial, we then start to recognize that actually this change is happening, or this crisis is happening. And this then leads to this sense of kind of incompetence, or I don't know how we're going to cope. So typically in the current crisis, we're seeing lots of people kind of thinking it is going to be complete doom and gloom. We aren't going to be able to cope. It's going to cause significant damage to our business, or whatever that might be, or again on a personal level. And in this moment of this is when the real fear kicks in, because we've gone through kind of initial fear-based reaction, but then this is when we really start to look into it and we start to realize how difficult the situation is, and our fears go into overdrive. And typically, we often make decisions at this point when actually it's the worst time for us to make some decisions. Because when we are in this sense of incompetence, I don't know how we're going to get through this, we often make some very important decisions that might have a long-term impact on our ability to succeed on the back of it. So this really important as we go through this phase, that we need to make certain decisions, absolutely, and we'll come later on as to we don't want to be kind of just sitting there waiting and seeing. But we need to make sure the decisions we are making aren't going to detriment us in the long term. So tuning back into our vision, tuning back into our focus of where we want to be on the back end of this, rather than focusing on the crisis itself, is really important in this phase. And for our teams, we need to make sure we're providing lots of support. We need to be there instilling in our teams the support that they need as they're also going through this reaction of kind of doom and gloom. What's going to happen to my well-being, my family, my income, all of those challenges that our teams are going through. We need to be there to provide lots of support in this time to help them through, but based on our vision of hope for the future. So I know in many situations, we're currently using the opportunity to furlough teams through this. The key for that is furlough is about helping our teams and helping our businesses to cope in the current downturn, with a view that we can maintain all of those teams as we come back stronger. So whilst the conversations about furlough may be happening, it's how do we set the tone that this is about making us stronger in the long run as we move through the current situation. Step 4 is about acceptance, and we need to make sure that this kind of point of acceptance is where we really recognize that this isn't going to go away. This is the kind of new reality, and we just need to work on what we can do rather than what we can't do. And the whole thing around acceptance, stage 4, is all about letting go of the past and accepting the new world, whatever that looks like. So a lot of the time within this change curve, we can't move forward into growing our future state and moving beyond the crisis if we've not accepted the crisis in the first place. So acceptance needs to happen. That acceptance might be acceptance of the fact that actually it is going to be really tough and we are going to have some difficulties, but we're letting go of the old way of working. We're accepting the fact that what was previously the way that things operated has perhaps changed, and maybe changed for good. And actually now we need to find out the way that we can thrive in the new world, accepting the fact that things have changed. So for leaders, it's about creating that clear sense of direction. This is the time when we need to be really focused on what we're going to do, rather than talking about the things that haven't worked or what the problems are. This is where leaders need to step up and demonstrate a clear sense of direction for their teams. Be really focused on what we can do, changing and reframing our thoughts, not to the problems, but to what the opportunities are, not to the dangers, but into that kind of future state beyond. The next stage of the change is when we start to kind of test. This is where we start to play with the new world. We start to understand it a little bit more, try different ideas, see what works, see what doesn't work. And typically in this time of testing, you'll find a lot of both yourself as individuals, but also our teams might start making mistakes because we're trying something new. We're trying a different way of doing things. And in that different way of doing things, that can sometimes lead to us not always getting it right, and maybe not always delivering to the standards that we had before, as we're learning new ways. So what's really important for us as leaders in this time is to focus on the wins. Rather than focus on what's going wrong, we need to focus on the kind of green shoots. And it was interesting to see on one of the presentations from Number 10 the other evening, the daily press briefings, where they started talking about the kind of the green shoots. So whenever you're working through a crisis, you're looking for those green shoots of opportunity. You don't want to overplay them, but you want to be looking for those quick wins, the things that are going positively, and how can I build on that rather than always going back into focusing on the negatives. This can be quite a dangerous time for us as leaders, because if we don't take that action of focusing on the wins, and we are critical of people who do things wrong in this testing phase, then we can often push people back through to the denial and incompetence phase of the curve, and create actually a vicious circle that exists within that loop. So really important as leaders, we focus on what people are doing well. How can we reinforce their sense of self, build their own confidence to enable them to perform better? And as we go into stage 6, it's really about searching for meaning. So what does this new world really look like to me? What's it really all about? How am I going to thrive and develop as we go through this, and really start to understand the reasons why things have changed and what the opportunity really does exist on the back of that. And for us as leaders, this is the time when we can start to increase the challenge. So those who've spent some time with me will know that I love working through the support challenge matrix. And when we get into this phase 6, this is where we really need to start increasing the challenge. We've dialed up the support as we've gone through some of the more challenging parts of the change. Now's the time to really push people to be their best, to challenge them, to find new ideas, to really become experts in this kind of new way of working, whatever that looks like, and giving them the opportunity to kind of really push on and thrive. And then the final stage of the change curve is when we get to kind of integration. I'm doing all the things that I used to be able to do, but I'm doing it in a new way. I'm thriving in this new world, and we are providing great services, great products, great opportunities for others around us. And the key thing around this for us as leaders, we then embed these changes and make sure that they become kind of operationalize and systemize within our businesses, to ensure that the great that we've taken through that testing phase, that we've built on in the search for meaning phase, becomes our new way of working, and we eradicate any of the things that don't work quite so well. So it's about embedding the best of our new way of working. So this is a model that I use a lot with businesses to think about change. And if we think about creating really effective change, we need to have these 6 things in place. So we need to have a vision. We talked about the importance of being able to see the future. So as you're leading through change, we've got to have a clear picture of what the future state we want to create looks like. And again, as leaders, when we're thinking it, and it can be really challenging when you're in a crisis position like we are at the moment, but we have to move our attention to that future state. What do we want our business to look like as we come through and move beyond the current crisis? How can we shift our attention to what the opportunity looks like, and really paint a clear vision for people as to what that will be? We then need to get consensus and buy-in. So that's about really sharing that vision with the teams around us, communicating clearly with our teams, maintaining those open feedback that gains their buy-in and support for what we're trying to do. We need to be investing in the skills of our teams. So again, great that you've all joined this webinar today. But in these moments where we are perhaps challenged around in a crisis moment, and we're thinking about this future state, have we got the skill set that's going to enable us to thrive in this future state? And if we haven't, how can we spend some of the time developing the skills of our teams to enable them to grow through? Now, I understand in the furlough situation that people can't do anything that actively contributes towards the financial success of your organization, but there's nothing stopping them, and certainly the apprenticeship boards have all given the green light for people to continue their skills and training in this period of time. So there's nothing stopping people from going through some skills and learning that enables them to grow as individuals, so when they come back to the business on the back of the furlough period, that they are better armed to help us to grow and develop. We need to make sure the incentives are there. So again, in the current climate, that might be around how we're going to build the business as we move forward and beyond this. So putting this work in now, it may not be about fancy bonus schemes or reward schemes, but it may be about actually we're going to have a sustainable quality business on the back of this that's going to provide for your families and for yourselves. So the incentive is there for people to really buy into. Have we got the resources in place? Are we making sure that we can rationalize our resources? It's a great time at the moment for us to think about how we're best using our resources. Are there better ways? In crisis, we'll always find there is an opportunity for creativity, because when you're forced to do things in a different way, it gives you an opportunity to relook at things and see, is there a better way of using the resources and tools that we have available to us? And then, of course, we need an action plan. How are we going to bring this to life? How's this going to happen? So I'm just going to take you through this model when some of these things are missing, what the kind of end reaction is. So when we're missing the clear vision, we have all the other things, but we don't have the vision in place. We often create confusion in our teams. And you often see this in crisis situations where there is lots and lots of confusion caused because there isn't that clear vision. We're doing lots of activity, but that activity isn't aligned behind something. When we don't get consensus, we often get sabotage. It may not be explicit sabotage, but we sometimes get implicit sabotage of people choosing to act in different ways, maybe making some self-driven choices rather than contributing to the overall team because they've not brought into the plan. If we don't have the skills, we often create anxiety. If you remember from the change curve, that point 3, where people have that sense of incompetence, when things are changing around them and they're not being helped to cope with the change, it often creates a high level of anxiety. And of course, when we have anxiety, we're in that fear-based way of thinking that isn't particularly conducive for us to being as effective as we want to be. So investing in people's skills to help them to gain the information they need to thrive is really important. When we don't have the incentives, then there's resistance. So if there's nothing in it for me, why would I commit to doing these changes? Why would I go through the process of reacting to the situation? If I can't see a positive outcome for myself, then why would I contribute to something bigger? So you often find resistance if there's nothing in it for me. If there aren't the resources there, then it often leads to frustration. So if you haven't got the tools in place to help you to come through the situation or to respond, then that often leads to a sense of frustration. And then finally, if you don't have an action plan in place, then it sometimes leads to this kind of false start where we kick off, we go in a direction of our vision, but because that's we don't have the plan in place and the strategy is not clearly identified, we end up trying things, it doesn't work, and then we go through endless loops of just keep trying, and people lose belief in the overall plan, and it starts to feel kind of helpless. So making sure we've got a clear plan in place is really important. So what I'm going to share now is just to kind of think around some of the things that we're seeing around us and kind of critically evaluate that, some of the research, but also having a look at kind of the global situation to see what's happening, just so we can identify some of the things that we maybe need to learn as individuals to understand our own ability to thrive in a crisis. So as Brian Tracy says in this quote, true test of leadership is how well you function in crisis. It's really easy to be a leader in good times. It's a little bit more challenging to be a leader in times like this. And this is where leaders really step up. Now, what I'm going to share is I'm going to have a look at a few nations across the world and just kind of look at their reactions. Now, I'm not saying that I'm an expert in geopolitics, and I'm certainly not an expert in virus control, but just looking at different reactions and different leadership styles to see what's coming out. Again, I understand that some people on this webinar may have been personally affected by the virus, so this is in no way designed to kind of cause any upset or angst, but just really for us to learn from different people and their approaches and what's good or bad in some of the reactions that we've seen. And of course, this is a moving feast, so we won't truly know the outcomes of this until we actually look into the impact of this crisis in maybe 12 months' time to see what really did work or didn't. But if we look at China as an initial country to examine, we all know about kind of the miscommunication and the denial that was existed in China in the initial period, where they kind of tried to hide and cover up the true extent of the impact. But once that wasn't a viable option, China actually reacted very quickly and made very firm and clear action to quarantine large swathes of its population. And I guess what we're seeing in China is, whilst they were slow initially, that rapid reaction that they took and the significant testing that took place on the back of it has led to them having a relatively rapid peak, and they're in effective control of the virus at the moment compared to other nations, pending or based on the fact that what we're seeing in terms of the numbers is true and accurate. But we're seeing very few new cases, and seems to be well within control within the country, and not overloading their system. Italy, we all know that it's kind of, for the size of the country, it's the worst hit nation in the world so far. And Italy were very slow to react initially, certainly on a national level. So their initial reaction was to try and keep it contained within a relatively small geographic area. But once they realized that this wasn't working, they then used a very strong fear-based tactics to drive their kind of quarantine and self-exclusion or self-isolation approach. And what's really interesting in the, if we look at kind of our work we did earlier, when we drive greater fear and greater sense of danger into a culture, and without really an understanding of the vision on the back end of it, we often create this resistance that we talked about in the last sense. And it's interesting to see that in Lombardy, which was the area that's worst affected in Italy, they've still estimated that 40% of the population there aren't abiding by the quarantine rules, because of this kind of real draconian approach is what you're kind of reading in the outcomes. So there'll be question marks about how effective that Italian response has been, and clearly the stats show a pretty brutal picture there. If we come over to the UK, again, initially maybe a little bit slow to respond, with the government really trying to balance the impact on the economy versus the advice against kind of containing the virus, and this kind of personal responsibility approach that we started with. I guess one of the things that I would say the government seems to have got right is through the very clear communication of the stay home, protect the NHS, save lives, that message being repeatedly delivered and very consistent, we're providing people with a why that sits behind the self-isolation. And in the main, there are a few people who perhaps haven't quite abided by that, and there is some still confusion about what it really means to self-isolate, and that might be related to the fact that it wasn't clear from the start. But in the main, most people are committing to that effort. And I think Boris has probably learned from his election win of a very simple statement: get Brexit done, keep it really simple rather than being overly complex. In this case, stay home, protect the NHS, save lives. Very consistent message delivered on every single briefing that they do. And it's the why that sits behind all their actions. And it means at least we've got an understanding of what we're doing or why we're doing the things that we're doing. So potentially got some opportunity that we can learn from as leaders. How clear about are we in terms of our messaging? Spain, another nation that's been very slow to respond, and again the numbers have risen dramatically, and unfortunately so have the deaths. Similar to Italy, they went from a late response to a very tight embargo, and it feels like they were maybe just too slow to even start that process. And of course, we're now seeing the impacts of that, unfortunately, in Spain. USA, very interesting, and there was a TV program last night about the USA, but if we look at their response, so and certainly our the wonderful Mr. Trump, in terms of initially labeling it as the Chinese disease, so creating this real distrust of something, really kind of a very protectionist approach. So if you think about the entire Trump presidency has all been about making America great at the expense of the rest of the world, potentially, and not really caring for that, but really focusing on their own internal boundaries rather than thinking of themselves as a member of the globe and a leader in the globe. And it really didn't kind of fully grasp the magnitude. We saw the endless optimism around that we'll all be back in our churches for Easter Sunday. And again, whilst we want to create a sense of hope, that's got to be based on some sense of credibility. So when you go from a deriding the crisis as being the Chinese disease to then it'll all be over in a couple of weeks and we'll be back in our churches, just kind of left you really thinking, actually, this is a leader who's not got fully into this real kind of crisis. To the change of heart this week, where actually now there's a recognition that it is going to be a really tough time, and you can't argue with the stats that are going on in the States and the wild rise of the disease over there. You've got a federal environment, and in that federal environment where individual states have got the right to make their own kind of choices, you need really strong clarity and leadership. And my personal view is that perhaps been absent prior to this week, and it's led to lots of different states having lots of different reactions, and therefore the population having lots of different reactions too. So really not taking it as seriously as they could have. And I guess the other thing that we're starting to see in the States is this positioning as kind of a global leader. Actually, they've taken a back seat in that, and they have created this void at a global level for people to step up. And there really hasn't been a nation that's taken the lead globally against this pandemic, whereas previously it may have been the US who perhaps would have filled that void. So interesting to see what impact that might have on a global level. Looking at South Korea, very quick response, use the full options of the state to test, track and isolate anyone with the virus and anyone who had contact with people who were infected. And they've had relatively low numbers and a much lower death rate. Seems to be testament to this rapid action. Again, we'll wait and see what happens on the back of it. Similar story in Germany. Widespread testing. I know there's lots of question marks around kind of the percentage of testing versus and what populations are in. But even though significant number of testings, significant people who've tested positive, but very few deaths in comparison to a lot of other European nations. So something is going right in the German way. We may not fully understand it, and then may see those figures start to rise. But at the moment, it seems like they've had a pretty good response that's controlling it. Sweden's a really interesting case. So Sweden have taken the approach that actually it's down to individuals to be responsible for their own actions. And what we're seeing in Sweden is that there is no lockdown. People are still able to go out to bars and restaurants. They put some restrictions in place, which they're asking people to abide by, which is you can't stand in a bar, you need to be seated and it has to be table service, but they're still able to operate. Shops are still open, malls are still open, and they're asking people to be responsible. They're encouraging people to work from home, but they're not enforcing it. And what we're seeing in Sweden is the traffic on their metro systems in Stockholm, for instance, is more than 50% down on what it normally would, without any direct restrictions on people's ability to travel. Now, in the UK, we've seen some modelling that shows that traffic in London, in particular, is pretty much the same as what it's been prior to the crisis, with a lockdown enforced. Whereas in Sweden, where it's personal responsibility, they haven't seen that kind of happening. The PM has said that he doesn't want to spread panic or rumours, doesn't want to create greater fear unless it's without kind of due necessity. So taking a very different approach to all of the rest of Europe. So it'll be interesting to see what happens in Sweden. The latest figures are it's a very similar country in size population to Austria, and currently they've got about 2,000 to 3,000 cases in Sweden, and in Austria they've got about 9,500. Austria is in strict lockdown, very much like Germany is. So interesting to see the numbers, and again, from us as leaders, it's that approach, and I'm going to come back to that kind of Swedish approach a little bit later on as we look at how we as leaders can take from this. Okay, I want to move on and just share some insight that's come from McKinsey and Company. So they've been doing some research of 763 leaders, senior leaders from around their kind of global operations, really talking about what is the most important organizational capabilities for managing in the corporate performance in the current crisis. So they're really talking about the here and now. So this is live research that's come in the last week or so around the current economic situation that we're in. And you can see on there that the two things are leadership and direction. So the ability to ensure that leaders shape and inspire the actions of others to drive better performance. That need to create a vision and to be inspiring for our teams around us, to keep the belief in our teams that's going to want them to be taking the actions that's going to deliver better performance. And then a clear sense of direction, the capacity to articulate where the company is heading and how to get there, and to align people appropriately, to create a clear statement of what's expected from our teams, and to give them clarity about where we're going and how we're going to get there is really important. And we can start to see that the numbers start to drop. Interestingly enough, you'll see that environment and values is kind of the lowest in this number that we can see there, lowest of the 9 dimensions. And ultimately, if you are in a business and you have been working on your values, then those values should have been embedded by now. You're never going to lead through a crisis if you suddenly start applying values into your business, because they're just not going to land. So people will, now is not a time to draw on this as a strategy. Your actions will always say more about your values than any statements or words. So the values you've embedded will already be enacted through your business. Now is not the time to be focused on that. But when we look at through the crisis and we start to look at the responses, we look beyond the crisis, so after the current situation, again, we can see leadership and direction up there. But what's taken over at the top is innovation. So we need to create new ways to work and operate in a changed world, and our ability to take advantage of the opportunities that come our way. So what's needed for a business to be innovative? Well, we need a culture that embraces change. We need a culture that provides psychological safety. If people are driven by fear and have not been looked after during this crisis, they will never be innovative for you in the future. So it's a really important point for us to be aware of as leaders, is the decisions and actions we're taking now and how we're helping our teams to feel is going to have a major impact on their willingness to contribute to our success as we move through. If we take decisions that are contrary to the good will of our people, and we don't create this sense of psychological safety in the short term when we're going through the crisis, when we call on them in the future, they're going to be less willing to respond. So we need to create this space where we are really capturing the kind of emotional sense of our teams, so they can feel like they're protected and safe. And when we're protected and safe, then we feel like we're able to contribute even better. So just an important thing for us to be aware of as we flip into looking beyond. McKinsey also looked at the individual kind of managing characteristics or the behaviors of managers in this time. And what, again, we're seeing is in there, we need to be inspiring is the top behavior through. And then after the current crisis is still pretty dominant. Defining the expectations and offering rewards, important in terms, stays important as you come out the other end. So again, this may not necessarily be about kind of bonuses, but this is about healthy, sustainable, quality businesses that are going to provide long-term opportunities for people. Challenging assumptions and encouraging risk-taking, again, becomes more important as we move through the other side. And then involving in decision-making, kind of a third saying that that's important or not, and then we start to see it kind of dropping down. What's really interesting is when we look at the attributes and behaviors that are important for driving corporate performance, monitoring individuals' performance. So close management of people in this moment is not the right thing to do. When we are managing closely, particularly when we're in remote and we're putting excessive controls on what people do, it's not building that sense of trust or psychological safety. So as we can see, only 15% and 12% are saying that monitoring people really closely in this current crisis is the right thing of behaviors. What's interesting, however, is when they looked at what's actually happening, they're seeing 38% of the respondents saying that actually the biggest driving behavior of leaders in this moment is to be monitoring individuals' performance. And it's one of the least effective ways for us to drive long-term performance in our business. So there's a disconnect between what we know is going to work versus what we are actually doing. And often that monitoring of individuals' performance closely is driven by that fear that we talked about earlier, of that being out of control. And the one thing I can do is control the actions of others. And therefore we tend to move into this kind of micromanagement type environment rather than actually inspiring or empowering people. So we need to make sure that we are being clear in that inspiration and the defining of expectations and rewards, and providing the empowerment for others to act. I just want to share some information with you from a guy called Louay Al-Rumani. I probably haven't pronounced his name right, but this guy, there's an article in Sunday Times last weekend, and this was a gentleman who ran a bank in Syria. And he ran a bank in Syria between 2015 and 2019, so right in the heart of the civil war that overtook and has devastated Syria as a nation. And he actually ran a bank successfully and grew that bank's kind of assets during this period of turbulence. So when he took over the bank, Syria was a relatively prosperous place with lots of opportunities on the horizon. And then, of course, the civil war was instigated and has, say, devastated the country. And what he shares in his article is kind of 5 tips that he gives for people to how to lead through a genuine crisis. And when he's talking about crisis, he was literally talking about banks where he was having mortars come through the ceiling of the banks, and people were literally risking their lives to go to work each day. And of course, there was lots of panic in the country about people wanting to get their money out of banks, etc. And one of the things that he shared, or his first tip, is to give people what they want. So when you're in a crisis, we need to make sure that we are satisfying the needs of the people who are either our customers or our employees. And the example he gave was in bank crisis in other nations, in Greece in particular, and Italy, what they did was they restricted the access to money. And by restricting access to money, because the fear that everybody would grab their money, fear-driven response, because they restricted access, everybody was then panic buying everything, or panic taking their monies out, and it caused an even bigger problem in their culture in the long run. So what Louay Al-Rumani did in his banks was he ordered all of his his teller people to put stacks of cash behind the screen so people could see that there was money available, and just managed to overcome this fear that people had that they wouldn't be able to get access to the money. And what he actually found is in the 4 years that he ran the bank, he actually saw deposits increase rather than decrease. He didn't have people taking money out of the bank. Actually, people were willing to deposit with him, and actually was very successful. And one of the things that he shares in his article is if you try to outsmart people in a crisis, they will hate you for it. So we've got to be open, we've got to be transparent, we've got to give our people what they need and what they're craving in this period of time. And we will build their support and that sense of psychological safety when we do that. We need to be flexible with the rules. So he says doing the right thing is way more important than doing things right. So we know that we'll have procedures and policies in place that may have existed prior to this current crisis. But there will be times in your business where you're going to need to adapt those rules to suit the current situation and not go through a lengthy process. Let's just do what's right in the short term. That gives us the opportunity to support our people, support our business. And it's way more important that we do the right thing rather than doing things right. So changing the way that you operate certain rules and procedures to make sure that it suits the current climate rather than being a stickler to, that's not the way we do things in our business. Be magnanimous, that's easy for some to say, but now is not the time to compete. So when we think about our opportunities, are the ways that we can do things that not only look after our own business, but also help others? How can we provide support to others around us? How can we work with our suppliers? How can we work with our clients to make sure that actually we're supporting them in the best way? An example he gave was because of the challenge of the physical danger, they laid on a bus service to get their workers to go to their banks, a free bus service that picked everybody up outside their houses and took them into work. And what he ended up doing was offering that support to all of the rival banks that were in the same locations. all paid for by his own bank, but it just created this sense of goodwill, not just from the other competitors, but actually the staff members in his own bank just saw him doing something that was good for everybody, and that sense of goodwill, that sense of magnanimous actions actually led to some real positivity. Talks about don't overplan. When things are changing so rapidly, just act and respond, and don't be afraid to fail. And I'll come back to that in a second, just to talk about that a little bit more. But just take actions, do what you feel is right based on doing the right things. And it's better to act quickly and rapidly than it is to wait and see. I'm going to talk about that in a second. And don't talk about survival. So this really struck home with me, and I guess kind of led me to thinking into today's session is nobody wants to just survive. If our best hope has to be more than just not dying. And what he said was, if you're only focusing on survival, you're going to create this kind of fear-based reaction. What we want to be focusing on is the world beyond the current crisis, and that we've survived, but we've also gone on and we are stronger through the whole process. Now, he raised in the article talking about the chairman of British Airways, just constantly talking about if we can survive this crisis. A business that's been operating for over 50 years should be in a strong enough position to be able to not just talk about survival. And actually, if you think about all the people who work for BA, they don't want to hear just about surviving. They want to hear about how the business is going to come back and be stronger on the back of it. We know it's going to be a challenge. We know it's going to be understandable. If we focus on survival, we're probably going to bring our own demise around. So I just want to show you a quick video. So it's a few minutes long, but this is Executive Director Michael Ryan of the World Health Organization talking about Ebola crises previously. But there's some really key lessons that are shared in this short video clip about actually our crisis management.
What we've learned in Ebola outbreaks is you need to react quickly. You need to go after the virus. You need to stop the chains of transmission. You need to engage with communities very deeply. Community acceptance is hugely important. You need to be coordinated. You need to be coherent. You need to look at the other sectoral impacts, the schools and security and economic. So it's essentially many of those same lessons, but the lessons I've learned after so many Ebola outbreaks in my career are be fast, have no regrets. You must be the first mover. The virus will always get you if you don't move quickly. And you need to be prepared. And I say this, one of the great things in emergency response, and anyone who's involved in emergency response will know this, if you need to be right before you move, you will never win. Perfection is the enemy of the good when it comes to emergency management. Speed trumps perfection. And the problem in society we have at the moment is everyone is afraid of making a mistake. Everyone is afraid of the consequence of error. But the greatest error is not to move. The greatest error is to be paralyzed by the fear of failure. And I think that's the single biggest lesson I've learned in Ebola responses in the past.
So I love that message that he shares there about the kind of this fear of failure. We've got to be fast to act. We've got to take action. It may not be perfect. It may not be the ideal solution, but it's way better to take action than it is to do nothing. So really important for us to learn that actually we need to move through this crisis and beyond by taking action, by doing things that are positive, focusing on what we can do rather than what we can't do. And really, when I started to look into this, it took me back to the book I wrote, Micro Leadership, and the 6 facets of micro leadership. And they really do resonate because micro leadership was written around kind of a future of work where we were moving into this highly volatile, uncertain, complex and ambiguous world, this VUCA world that's talked a lot in kind of military circles. And of course is a real description of the world that we're currently facing. And when we looked at micro leadership, we really focused on what are the attributes that we need as leaders to be able to cope and thrive in an environment where actually everything is uncertain. And we identified these kind of 6 habits of living the gap, which was all about our ability to spot the gaps between what's happening, what are the opportunities, and really focus on our ability of what we can do rather than what we can't do, and see the opportunities rather than the dangers. We talked about being a connector. So one of the things that's come out through this crisis is no single nation is going to solve this crisis on their own. The more that we can connect with others and engage with others and work with others around us and use the benefits of our networks to help us to thrive is really, really critical. If we look at the US response, which is about closing the borders and really focusing internally on self, even without agreement from the EU partners at the time, just showed that nationalism that was coming out at a time when we probably need to connect across boundaries rather than focusing on our own internal approaches. The other habit we looked at is find a way. So having that ability to not see setbacks as diminishing us, but see setbacks as a challenge for us to be creative, to be innovative, tunes into what McKinsey have said that we're going to need on the back of this innovation to drive us through. Dare to fail was the other habit. Again, really echoes the video that we've just seen. The willingness to not wait for perfect, but just to act, to take risks, to try and approach. I was just talking to a friend this morning prior to the webinar about, in the US, they seem to be in the medical system. They seem to be willing to try different things to try and treat patients who are kind of in very severe cases, knowing that it may not work, but actually, those people are in really bad shape anyway, and actually why don't we try something that could work and might help them? Whereas it seems in the UK that we are a little bit reserved about maybe trying some things that are a bit different in case it goes wrong, and maybe some of the implications of that. So we've got to be willing to try things, and in our businesses we've got to try new ways of tackling the challenge that we're in. The fifth habit was show up. Really a time for us as leaders to show up, to take on the pressure of making decisions in a time when nobody knows what the answer is. But what I've been saying to people all this week is, when there is a place where there is no right answers, there are also no wrong answers. So in a world where there are no clear blueprints for what's going on, there are also no wrong ways of doing things. We will just learn and we will grow and we'll develop as we go through the process. So it's really important for us as leaders to show up, to really demonstrate our ability to make decisions and to be that leading light. There are times as leaders when we need to step into the fore and be out front, and now is one of those times. And then finally, the last one is probably the most important, which is live to serve. We all need to be serving the people around us. We all need to be having the courage to step in and taking responsibility to serve and to help the people who we are in our care within our teams. And if we want to take a guide from this current crisis, looking at the wonderful people in our NHS who are putting their own lives potentially at risk by stepping up to help others, is the greatest message that we could ever have as leaders in this crisis, to think about what we need to do to help the people around us. How do we step up and serve the people who are around us in our businesses? So I just wanted to kind of share that. Again, it's not kind of a self-promotion here, but just really to think into how I looked at leadership and how we support leaders in the work that we do to prepare people for kind of, we never imagined that a pandemic like this would happen and it would cause such crisis. But we did recognize that the world was shifting and changing in the way that it operates, and we were going to be in more positions of uncertainty than we perhaps have appreciated in the past. And that's what led us to create micro leadership and some of the work we've done around there. So I just want to take a moment just to share with you an opportunity that we are launching called Leading Minds, and it's kind of a new way for us to create leadership development. And because of the current crisis, we're offering this at a relatively low cost per person of £89. And what we're doing is we're doing a 90-minute facilitated Zoom meeting just like this, where we'll be able to engage face-to-face to create a community of leading minds who come together and work together to help one another, to work across organizational boundaries to support each other through this crisis. The agenda is driven by you, so it's what you want to cover. What are the challenges you're currently facing? How are you coping with those? What are your questions that you've got? What are some of the ideas and thoughts you have to be able to talk through to help you drive through? It'll be an open, supportive space for you to find your own path to success. Creating mutual accountability, supporting one another as you go through, ongoing support via a WhatsApp group or an email group, and we'll be providing additional member-only resources and content, a special weekly blog. And the aim is that we support you through the peak of the current crisis and beyond for those that want it. So we're going to be starting this process on Monday. For anybody who wants to join in, then they can join the session on Monday, and it will happen every second week throughout the crisis. Initially, we've got 5 sessions planned. That'll take us through 10 weeks from Monday through to hopefully beyond, where we're back into let's pray that we're back into normal operation and give people an opportunity to help build their business as they go through. So we'll send the link out to this program following today's webinar with the recording. We'd love you to join in. We think it's a great opportunity to take a different approach to helping our leaders develop and thrive in this current climate. So I'd love to invite you onto there. So I'm now going to just open up the chat function to anybody who's got any questions. What I would love for you to add, for those who are on the call now, is just share one thing that you've taken away from today. What's your key learning from today's session? So add that into the chat function. What's the one thing you're taking away? And then I'm open to ask any questions that anybody has that they want to share with me, again, using the chat function to ask any of those questions. So I'll just wait in line for those questions to come through. Thanks, Richard. Great to have you on the call. So just share with me your one key takeaway. What's the one thing that you have taken away from today? And I say, if anybody has any questions, then please feel free to ask those questions, and I'll stay online for as long as needed to answer any of your questions. So if you're not familiar with Zoom, you can find the chat function. Some of you found it early, but you can find the chat function just at the top. And you can see, if you go into the menu system, you'll see there's more options, and there's in the chat there. You can click on the chat function to bring it up if you've not used that function before on Zoom. So just let me know if you've got any questions. If not, then thank you all for your time this morning, and you're free to dial off the meeting if you don't have any questions. I would love to hear what your one takeaways are, so if you wouldn't mind just dropping those before you leave, that would be really helpful for me to understand what's resonated with you this morning. And I say I'll stay on the line for as long as needed to answer any questions that people might have. We'll be sending out the recording following to today's session. That'll go to anybody who's registered for this morning's session. Please feel free to share that with anybody in your businesses that you think might find it useful. We're not protective of our content here at Mindset Leadership. We just want to help as many people as we can. So please feel free to share the webinar link to people who you think might find it useful. So I'll just sit and wait for any questions to come through. I'm not receiving any as of yet, but hopefully people have. I say, if not, then I will look forward to seeing you all soon on the other side of the current crisis, beyond where we currently are. Okay, not seeing any comments coming through, so I'm not sure if anybody's mid typing. Again, I'll stay on the line until people have dropped off. Say, if not, thank you all for your time. If you want to dial off the call, then you're very welcome to, and enjoy the rest of your day. I say I will stay online just if there is any specific questions that are coming through. Okay, it looks like everybody's dialed up pretty much. So I'm going to call a close to the meeting there.